The sky above the Pacific trembled with the sound of engines and fear. April 6, 1945. The first wave of Kikusui, Japan's mass kamikaze assault, swept toward the U.S. Fifth Fleet off Okinawa. Dozens of Zero fighters, stripped of armor and painted with crude red suns, roared low over the sea. Each carried a single 500-kilogram bomb, and a pilot who would never return. Below them, the sea bristled with American warships, destroyers, carriers, cruisers, every gun turret alive, every radar dish spinning. Invisible pulses swept the sky, searching, tracking, locking. Within seconds, flak bursts erupted in perfect rhythm. Not random anymore, but guided by an unseen hand. Zeros exploded mid-air before reaching the fleet. The horizon became a wall of smoke and shattered wings. For the first time, Japan's suicide pilots realized the Americans could see through the sky itself. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us which country or city you're watching from in the comments. The kamikaze's terror had met a new kind of defense, one not built on bravery, but on invisible waves of science. And this battle was only beginning. By late 1944, Japan's empire was collapsing under the weight of an unrelenting Allied advance. One island after another, Saipan, Guam, Leyte, had fallen. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most formidable in the Pacific, was now little more than a shadow fleet, crippled, outnumbered, and outproduced. Yet, even in this defeat, Tokyo found one final weapon: human sacrifice. The term kamikaze meant divine wind. To Japan's military leaders, it evoked the typhoon that had destroyed Kublai Khan's Mongol fleet in the 13th century. A miracle that saved Japan from invasion. In 1944, as American carriers closed in again, Japanese propagandists invoked that same divine wind to stir desperation into duty. The Kamikaze Corps was born. Young pilots, many barely 20, trained for one mission: to crash their planes directly into enemy ships. At first, the tactic worked with terrifying effect. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, kamikazes sank or damaged dozens of Allied ships. For the first time, American sailors faced an enemy they couldn't deter. You could shoot at a kamikaze all you wanted. He wasn't trying to survive. The skies became filled with suicide dives, flaming wrecks, and the sickening thud of explosions against steel hulls. By the winter of 1945, U.S. commanders understood they were facing not a strategy, but a psychology. Japan had turned death itself into a weapon. Each kamikaze sortie promised to take one or more American ships with it. Morale aboard the fleet wavered. Pilots spoke of endless attacks from sunrise to sunset. Gunners recalled seeing faces, actual faces, of men aiming straight for them. The human toll was devastating. In 6 months, kamikazes damaged or sank more than 300 U.S. vessels, killing over 5,000 sailors. Destroyers were hit so often they were called tin coffins. Carriers were scorched and crippled. And though the U.S. navies might seem endless, one truth haunted every sailor. No matter how many planes they shot down, more kept coming. In that crucible of fear, a new weapon was being prepared, one that would quietly change the balance of power in the Pacific skies. Deep within naval laboratories, engineers worked around the clock on something revolutionary: radar-guided fire control. Instead of guessing where an aircraft might be, ships could now see them coming, even in cloud, darkness, or smoke, and target them with deadly precision. This invisible system would soon be paired with another breakthrough: the VT proximity fuse, a miniature radar in a shell that could sense when an aircraft was near and detonate automatically. No more blind shooting, no more wasted shells. Each burst could now find its target by itself. Together, these technologies would transform the Pacific battlefield from one of human instinct to one of electronic vision. The suicide pilots who had once terrorized entire fleets were about to meet something even more unyielding: a weapon that never blinked. And so, as 1945 began, the stage was set. Japan's divine wind versus America's invisible eye. the story of radar-guided fire control began not on the battlefield, but in the quiet laboratories and shipyards of Britain and the United States years before the kamikazes appeared. In the late 1930s, as the world moved toward total war, Allied scientists were already racing to harness one idea: that radio waves could not only detect the enemy, but guide weapons to destroy them. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, radar was still an experimental advantage. Early systems like the CXAM and SC radar could detect incoming aircraft, but gunners still had to rely on eyesight and instinct to fire. In the chaos of battle, this meant shells exploded too soon, too late, or not at all. A destroyer might fire hundreds of rounds and bring down only one plane. The ocean would fill with black puffs of wasted smoke. But inside the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., and the workshops of the Bell Telephone Laboratories, a revolution was quietly underway. Engineers designed a new kind of director, the Mk-37 fire control system, a complex mechanism of gears, gyroscopes, and servos that could link radar detection directly to the ship's gun batteries. It could predict a plane's path, automatically adjusting the elevation and bearing of the guns. Then came the true miracle: the VT proximity fuse. This tiny device, no larger than a flashlight battery, carried its own miniature radar set. When fired, it emitted radio waves. As soon as those waves bounced off a nearby object, like an airplane, the fuse triggered detonation. Each shell effectively became a hunter, sensing its prey in the sky. In early 1943, the proximity fuse was tested aboard ships in the Atlantic. The results stunned naval officers. Where once a dozen shells might be needed to down a single bomber, now just one or two did the job. The skies over fleet formations began to look different. Explosions occurred around aircraft, not behind them. American gunners had suddenly become deadly accurate. By 1944, as the Allies pushed closer to Japan, the U.S. Navy began fitting most of its destroyers and cruisers with Mk-37 directors linked to radar systems like the Mk-12 and Mk-22. These radars could track multiple targets, calculate speed and altitude, and feed firing solutions directly into gun turrets. Radar operators watched glowing dots sweep across screens, each one an approaching enemy plane. This new integration marked the birth of the Combat Information Center, CIC, the nerve center of modern naval warfare. Deep inside every major U.S. warship, sailors hunched over radar scopes, plotting enemy paths in real time. From those dimly lit rooms, officers could coordinate anti-aircraft fire with mathematical precision. By the time the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted in June 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar-guided, guns and fighter direction had already proven devastating. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed before they even saw the fleet. American sailors began to realize that technology, not just bravery, was now shaping the course of the Pacific War. But the Japanese High Command also learned from that defeat. When they launched the desperate Kamikaze strategy later that year, they hoped to overcome radar and proximity fuses with sheer numbers. The idea was brutal but simple. Radar could track targets, but it couldn't stop hundreds of suicidal pilots arriving all at once. And for a while, it worked. At Leyte Gulf, radar screens overflowed with blips. Gun crews fought until barrels glowed red. Yet the technology improved with every battle. Operators learned to filter noise, to identify diving kamikazes faster, to focus fire with near-machine precision. By early 1945, the Americans had turned radar gunnery into an art. Ships operated in tight, layered formations where radar-directed destroyers shielded carriers and battleships. The ocean itself became a vast electronic web. The stage was now set for the most intense trial of all, Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific, and the deadliest kamikaze campaign ever witnessed. Here, the invisible technology born in laboratories would face its ultimate test. Whether radar could truly protect flesh and steel against a storm of human fire. The human angle. Faces behind the kamikazean. The spring of 1945, Japan's airfields were filled not with hardened aces, but with boys, many no older than 20. They wrote farewell letters under cherry blossoms, drank a final cup of sake, and climbed into planes that would never return. To them, death was not a defeat. It was a duty. Their instructors told them they were bullets of the Emperor. Their mission, to destroy the American fleet with their own bodies, was wrapped in honor, nationalism, and desperation. But the reality was far from noble. Many of these pilots had only a few weeks of training. They barely knew how to handle their Zero fighters, and some crashed before even reaching their targets. Yet the propaganda machine called them heroes. Schoolgirls waved flags as they departed. Newspapers printed their last poems. "If only I had 7 lives to give for Japan." Inside the cockpits, however, fear was everywhere. Diaries recovered after the war revealed trembling handwriting. "I am afraid, but I must do it." Some pilots were volunteers, others pressured. By 1945, Japan's command knew most would die in vain. But to a nation cornered by defeat, the kamikaze became both weapon and illusion. The last hope that faith could conquer science. On the other side of the ocean, the Americans watching these suicides weren't triumphant. They were horrified. Sailors saw men burning, still gripping control sticks as they dived into decks. Officers wrote home describing it as madness made real. The Pacific sky had turned into a graveyard, where courage and futility met in midair. If you're finding this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us which country or city you're watching from in the comments. The tactical angle. The fleet learns to survive against that wave of human sacrifice. The U.S. Navy had to evolve faster than ever before. The kamikaze threat forced a complete rethinking of fleet defense. Every ship became part of a vast, coordinated organism. A living wall of steel, radar, and fire. The key was the radar picket line. Destroyers stationed miles ahead of the main fleet. Their role was suicidal in its own way, to be the first to detect incoming kamikazes and draw their attack before they reached the carriers. Each destroyer carried radar-guided guns and combat information centers, where sailors tracked blips crawling toward them at 400 miles per hour. The moment a signal appeared, alarms screamed across the ship. Gunners raced to their stations. Radar directors locked onto the incoming plane. Orders snapped through loudspeakers. "Commence firing!" Shells filled the air, bursting in perfect rhythm, creating a deadly net of flak. To a kamikaze pilot, it looked like flying into a storm of lightning. The fleet's defensive formation became a masterpiece of geometry and timing. Outer destroyers picked up the first contact. Mid-range cruisers joined in seconds later. Carriers stayed deep in the center, shielded by overlapping radar coverage. The system worked like a living brain, detecting, predicting, striking, all in less than a minute. Still, it was never foolproof. When hundreds of kamikazes came at once, even radar couldn't track them all. Some broke through. Ships like the USS Bunker Hill and USS Franklin suffered catastrophic hits, killing hundreds. Yet compared to earlier battles, the ratio of kills to hits began to change. Radar and proximity fuses were saving lives, minute by minute. Every success came at a cost. Radar picket ships became prime targets. Crews aboard destroyers like USS Laffey faced dozens of kamikazes at once, and still survived thanks to radar-guided fire. The sailors called it controlled chaos. The radar scope became their only vision, their lifeline through the smoke and fire. The U.S. Navy's adaptation showed a rare kind of evolution, not born from new weapons alone, but from discipline, training, and technology working as one. Against men who had turned death into strategy, America answered with precision, mathematics, and radio waves. By the time the Okinawa campaign reached its midpoint, Japanese commanders began to realize something unthinkable. Their divine wind was no longer divine. The more they attacked, the fewer ships they sank. Radar had turned the kamikaze's greatest weapon, surprise, into predictable motion. And soon, that invisible advantage would decide the battle. The technological angle, the unseen weapon to the sailors who manned the radar rooms, It felt like seeing the future before it arrived. Radar wasn't just a device. It was a sixth sense. Beneath the steel decks of cruisers and carriers, dark rooms glowed in green light. On the circular screens, small blips of light crept toward the center, each one a potential killer. Operators whispered bearings into headsets, their voices calm despite the chaos above. Every radar-guided gun on the fleet worked like part of a single machine. The Mech-37 director sat atop the superstructure like a mechanical brain, constantly rotating, tracking the coordinates relayed by the radar antenna. Data moved down into analog computers. The MCAPE-1A fire control computer, a masterpiece of gears and electrical relays. It calculated angles, speed, altitude, and wind, then sent commands to the turrets automatically. When the guns fired, each shell carried the secret of radar inside it, the VT proximity fuse. Instead of exploding on contact, it exploded when its own miniature radar sensed a plane nearby. It was like giving the shell its own intelligence. The effect was devastating. Enemy aircraft that once slipped through flak curtains now disappeared mid-dive, shattered in bursts of perfectly timed explosions. The air around the fleet turned into a deadly dome. Japanese pilots described it as flying into invisible walls of fire. Radar also revolutionized coordination. Carriers used it to vector fighters toward kamikazes long before they were visible. Destroyers used it to triangulate airspeed and altitude. Ships could now fight at night, through smoke, or in storms, conditions that once favored surprise attacks. It was technology's silent triumph, and yet it carried a strange irony. The weapon that saved thousands of American lives was one the human eye could never see. The leadership angle, minds that fought with machines behind every advance in technology, stood commanders who dared to trust it. Admirals like Raymond Spruance and Mark Mitcher realized early that victory in the Pacific would depend not just on courage, but on calculation. Spruance, a quiet strategist known as Electric Brain, insisted that radar data be centralized. His fleets developed the Combat Information Center, CIC concept, a darkened, enclosed space where officers could visualize the entire battle on radar scopes and plotting boards. It was a revolution in command philosophy. No longer would decisions rely solely on a captain's eyes or instincts. Mitcher, the legendary carrier commander, pushed the same principle in air defense. He believed in fighting blind, trusting radar and instruments over human sight. During the Okinawa campaign, he ordered radar picket ships and carriers to synchronize firing through radio coordination, allowing hundreds of guns to focus on the same kamikaze waves simultaneously. These men understood something profound. Technology was not a replacement for courage. It was its extension. Every operator in a radar room, every sailor reloading a proximity-fused shell, was part of a larger, invisible orchestra. Leadership also meant restraint. Radar tempted commanders to shoot at everything that moved, but discipline was critical. The Pacific sky was often filled with friendly planes returning from missions. It took composure and faith in the system to separate friend from foe using only the ghostly echoes of radar. Through this combination of human intellect and machine precision, the U.S. Navy learned to dominate an enemy that lived for chaos. The Japanese threw men at the fleet. The Americans built a system that outthought them, the enemy's angle. When faith met science, from the Japanese perspective, the change was terrifying. Kamikaze leaders expected chaos and panic, but what they found was order, mechanical, unflinching, inhuman order. Reports from surviving pilots spoke of black smoke walls that seemed to move and follow them. They described shells exploding before they even reached their targets. Many believed the Americans had invented a death wave, a supernatural shield in the sky. But it wasn't magic. It was math, radar frequency, and precision engineering. By late April 1945, Japan's commanders understood that even the bravest pilot could not defeat what he could not see. The kamikaze special attack units kept flying, but their success rate fell sharply. Of the thousands of sorties launched at Okinawa, fewer than 1 in 10 reached their targets. And yet, Japan refused to stop. Pride and desperation had fused into one. They believed each pilot's sacrifice still delayed the inevitable. One more hour for the homeland to prepare. One more moment of defiance before surrender. As their empire burned, the Japanese airmen looked skyward and saw not gods or glory, but the reflection of radar-guided lightning. Technology had stripped away the romance of war. The heavens they once believed divine were now ruled by machines. And soon, that cold reality would reach its breaking point in the waters off Okinawa, where the largest suicide attack in human history would crash headlong into the most advanced air defense system ever. Built April 6, 1945. The day the sky fell, dawn rose gray and heavy over the Pacific. The invasion of Okinawa had begun only days earlier, but the Japanese were ready to unleash their final storm. They called it Operation Tengo, a massive, coordinated suicide assault unlike anything seen before. At exactly 8:00 a.m., the radar screens aboard the U.S. Fifth Fleet began to flicker with movement. First a few dots, then dozens, then hundreds. The combat information centers aboard Picket destroyers lit up with warnings. Multiple bogies inbound, range 70 miles. 60 miles! Closing fast. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, overseeing amphibious operations, looked at the radar reports and understood the scale of what was coming. Nearly 400 kamikaze aircraft launched from Kyushu were heading straight for his fleet. Their targets, carriers, transports, and the fragile heart of the invasion. For the men on radar duty, it was like watching death crawl toward them in waves. The command to all ships went out instantly. Condition 1, General Quarters. Across the fleet, alarms screamed. Gun crews scrambled to stations. Radar directors swung into motion. Above deck, sailors could already hear the distant drone of engines. Then came the order. Commence firing! The first radar-guided salvos erupted. The sea around the picket line exploded in bursts of black and orange. Each proximity-fused shell burst in mid-air, detonating within 50 feet of its target. Kamikazes disintegrated before reaching visual range. Wings torn apart, fuselages ripped by invisible precision. For the Japanese pilots, it was chaos. The air filled with timed explosions that seemed to follow them wherever they turned. Some tried to weave. Others dove lower, hugging the ocean's surface. But the radar guns tracked every move. Aboard the USS Bush and USS Colhoun, destroyers stationed on the northern radar line, the battle reached nightmare intensity. Within minutes, dozens of kamikazes descended at once. The radar operators shouted bearings faster than human ears could follow. The gunners fired until their barrels glowed. The air was thick with smoke, shrapnel, and the sound of shrieking engines. The radar-guided defenses were working, but they were also overwhelmed. Some planes slipped through the barrage. The Bush was struck 3 times in 20 minutes, each impact a fiery explosion that shook the ship apart. The Colhoun followed soon after. Even as they burned, their radar systems continued transmitting until the final moment. To sailors aboard other ships, it felt like the ocean itself was alive with lightning. The coordination between radar and gunfire had turned the fleet into a mechanical beast. Seeing, predicting, striking. Each new kamikaze wave was met with layers of flak timed to explode in its path. Yet the battle was not one-sided. The Japanese showed terrifying persistence. Some pilots flew through burning debris, their wings shredded, still diving toward targets. The USS Laffey, later nicknamed the ship that would not die, was attacked by 22 kamikazes in 80 minutes. Radar-guided gunners shot down most, but 6 made it through. Flames spread across the deck, ammunition exploded, and sailors fought the fires while still firing at the sky. Despite the chaos, radar was proving decisive. In earlier battles, such a wave might have annihilated the fleet. Now, thanks to radar and proximity fuses, the Americans could track and destroy kamikazes long before they reached their targets. The kill-to-loss ratio began to tilt. Thousands of lives saved by seconds of detection. Admiral Spruance's command reports from that day captured the change. The effectiveness of radar-directed gunfire has turned the tide of air defense. Without it, the losses would have been catastrophic. When the smoke cleared that evening, the numbers told the story. Of the nearly 400 kamikazes launched, more than 250 were shot down before hitting anything. The remaining aircraft inflicted damage, yes, but the fleet still stood. The radar-guided guns had held the line. For Japan, it was a blow deeper than numbers. The kamikaze had been their symbol of unstoppable faith. And now that faith was being torn apart by invisible waves of American science. But the storm wasn't over. The next week, the Japanese would launch an even larger attack, one that would push radar and human endurance to their absolute limits. May 1945, the final storm over Okinawa. The first waves of April had bloodied both sides. By early May, Japan was running out of everything: fuel, aircraft, even trained pilots, but not resolve. From airfields on Kyushu, they prepared one last coordinated strike. Kikusui No. 6, the sixth of 10 massive suicide waves launched during the Okinawa campaign. To the Americans, it was déjà vu, but this time they were ready. The radar network around Okinawa had grown into the most complex ever assembled at sea. Dozens of Picket destroyers now formed a perimeter stretching nearly 100 miles, linked by radio, radar, and coordinated gunnery data. Fighter direction officers in the Combat Information Centers, CICs, plotted every incoming formation in real time. The ocean had become one enormous radar grid. At 7:20 a.m. on May 4, 1945, the screens began to glow again. From the north, over 350 kamikaze aircraft were inbound. Army bombers, Navy fighters, even obsolete training planes packed with explosives. But now, every ship from destroyer to carrier was part of one synchronized defense. The order echoed across the fleet. Commence radar-controlled barrage. Within moments, the sea erupted. The horizon flickered with timed bursts, each one detonating at a mathematically perfect distance. Shells armed with VT proximity fuses created invisible spheres of death around the fleet. Pilots who once slipped through flak now found themselves flying into precision-tuned explosions. From the air, it must have looked like madness. Tracer fire weaving geometric arcs, bursts lining the sky like constellations. Yet it was not chaos. It was calculation. Each radar operator, each gunner, each circuit in the Mk-37 director was synchronized like gears in a vast machine. The USS LSM-195, one of the smaller landing ships, recorded the moment. The air was solid with steel. The shells didn't miss. They anticipated. Still, the Japanese came on. 1-0 after another plunged through fire, some breaking apart mid-dive, others striking water in flames. The USS Shea was hit by a bomb-laden plane. Her radar room was destroyed instantly. Yet even crippled, other ships around her took up the signal data, continuing the defense as though one mind guided them all. Further south, the destroyer USS Aaron Ward endured 6 near-simultaneous attacks. Radar-guided guns downed several attackers, but 3 broke through, slamming into her superstructure. The ship barely survived, listing heavily, fires everywhere. Crews fought the blazes for hours, and when the smoke cleared, the radar antenna was still turning. The Americans were beginning to witness a transformation in warfare. Machines were not only amplifying human senses, they were replacing them. Where once sailors had scanned horizons with binoculars, now operators fought entire battles by staring into the ghostly glow of radar scopes. The enemy was reduced to a dot, a frequency, a range, a solution, and yet that cold efficiency saved lives. On May 11th, another colossal wave of Kikusui attacks struck. Over 300 kamikazes launched, but radar pickets detected them at 80 miles. Carrier-based Hellcats were vectored in to intercept. By the time the planes reached the fleet, radar-guided flak had already thinned their numbers. The USS Bunker Hill, though hit disastrously by 2 suicide planes that morning, was one of the few major losses. Without radar coordination, the entire carrier group might have been wiped out. For Japan, these attacks drained the last of their aerial strength. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every plane that fell marked another wound in an air force already dead on its feet. By June, kamikaze operations had become desperate improvisations. Old biplanes, obsolete trainers, anything that could fly. But the Americans had reached technological supremacy. Radar had turned what was once chaos into pattern, what was once blind panic into anticipation. The invisible waves pulsing from steel masts had made the difference between survival and annihilation. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, more than 1,300 kamikaze aircraft had been launched. Over 1,300 were destroyed before striking a single target. Most shot down through radar-directed gunnery and proximity fuses. The numbers told a truth that even Japan could not deny. Faith could not defeat science. In the calm after the battle, as the sea settled beneath the smoldering wreckage, sailors stood by their silent radar screens and realized they had witnessed the future. The war in the Pacific was entering its final phase, and the next chapter of warfare would belong to the machines. When the Battle of Okinawa finally ended in June 1945, the Pacific was littered with the wreckage of two nations' final efforts, one built on desperation, the other on innovation. The Japanese had launched over 1,900 kamikaze aircraft during the campaign, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors and wounding thousands more. But in cold numbers, the scale of failure was clear. For every ship struck, nearly 10 kamikazes had been destroyed before impact. The reason was invisible. Radar. For the first time in human history, war had been fought by machines that could see what men could not. The U.S. Navy's radar-directed fire control systems had proven decisive. The Mach 37 directors, linked with Mach 12 and Mach 22 radars, turned every destroyer and cruiser into a deadly predictor. With the addition of the VT proximity fuse, shells no longer depended on luck. They became thinking weapons, bursting at precise distances. Fleet after action reports captured the astonishment of officers. The proximity fuse alone increased our anti-aircraft efficiency by a factor of 5. Commander Naval Ordnance Bureau, June 1945. Radar coordination turned the fleet into one living organism. It fought as a single body. USS Laffey CIC report, April 1945. The data from Okinawa revealed that radar-directed weapons accounted for nearly 75% of all kamikaze kills. This technological edge not only saved the U.S. invasion force, it preserved the timetable for the final assault on Japan. Without radar, Okinawa might have been a massacre. The Japanese military, meanwhile, entered a state of disbelief. After every failed attack, reconnaissance pilots returned with the same observation. The Americans knew we were coming. Their once secret night raids were now met by fully alert gunners whose weapons fired in perfect unison. The myth of divine protection, the kamikaze spirit, began to collapse. In Tokyo, a senior officer of the Imperial Navy admitted privately, "Our young men fly with hearts of fire, but the enemy's machines see beyond the clouds. We cannot strike what we cannot surprise." Radar had done more than protect ships. It had altered the psychology of war. American sailors no longer fought blind. They no longer waited helplessly for the sudden scream of engines. Now they could watch the danger coming, track it, name it, and destroy it. The terror of unpredictability was gone. Still, victory carried a human cost. Radar had made the battle more efficient, but not less horrifying. Survivors of radar picket ships remembered the agony of those days. The endless watch, the constant alarms, the green radar glow that haunted their dreams. They fought knowing they were the first line of defense, often the first to die. The USS Laffey, Bush, Aaron Ward, Hugh W. Hadley, and others became legends of endurance. These small ships absorbed the fury meant for entire fleets, guided by the same radar systems that allowed them to fight until their hulls were shredded. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in his final report on the Okinawa campaign, wrote words that defined the technological age to come. The Battle of Okinawa proved that the control of the electromagnetic spectrum is as decisive as the control of the sea. With that, the U.S. Navy understood something far greater. Radar was not merely a weapon, but a language of dominance. Whoever mastered the invisible waves would command the future of war. As the guns fell silent, the last echoes of the kamikaze faded into smoke. What remained was a new kind of power, one that didn't roar or burn, but pulsed quietly through the air, unseen yet unstoppable. The war's final months revealed a profound shift that few at the time fully understood. The Battle of Okinawa had not only marked Japan's defeat, it had marked the dawn of a new kind of warfare. Invisible frequencies, not fleets or fortresses, had decided the outcome. In the weeks that followed, U.S. intelligence officers began analyzing the wreckage of downed Japanese aircraft. They expected to find mechanical weakness, but instead, they found tragedy. Many kamikaze planes had been hastily assembled, engines worn, instruments failing, radios broken. The pilots had flown with blind faith into a battlefield, governed by invisible physics they could neither perceive nor comprehend. The Naval Research Laboratory compiled its after-action studies quickly. The results confirmed what every radar operator already knew. The integration of radar, radio, and VT fusing formed the first complete electronic defense network in human history. From that moment on, radar was no longer a tool. It was the nervous system of modern war. Ships leaving Okinawa were immediately retrofitted with enhanced radar suites and improved fuses. The lessons of the Pacific were already shaping future doctrines. Within weeks, U.S. scientists were adapting these same principles for new weapons: guided missiles, jet interceptors, and long-range early warning systems. The invisible walls of defense that had shielded Okinawa would one day extend across entire continents. Japan, meanwhile, faced a national reckoning. The Kamikaze campaign, meant to display divine resolve, had instead become a symbol of technological helplessness. As captured diaries and letters were translated, historians found not fanaticism, but resignation. One pilot wrote, "We do not fear death. We fear being forgotten." After the war, many surviving Japanese officers admitted that they had underestimated America's scientific power. Admiral Ugaki Matomi, one of the last kamikaze commanders, noted in his final writings that radar had robbed the Japanese of their only advantage: surprise. He called it the unseen curtain between heaven and earth. The devastation of Okinawa accelerated Japan's collapse. Without effective air power, its remaining defenses were symbolic. When the atomic bombs fell in August, the nation was already broken, not just by fire, but by the realization that modern war had become a contest of intellect and electricity. In Washington, the U.S. Navy quietly began classifying radar and fuse technologies under new research bureaus. The Office of Naval Research, founded in 1946, drew directly from the scientists who built those wartime systems. They foresaw that the future battlefield would belong not to the strongest, but to the most perceptive, those who could see first, think faster, and strike before being seen. The Cold War would soon prove them right. Radar evolved into distant early warning lines across the Arctic, into the Nike missile network, and into the Aegis combat system decades later, all descendants of the Mach-37, the green screens, and the silent men of Okinawa. For Japan, radar became part of its rebirth too. Under U.S. occupation, its scientists studied American post-war radar theory. The same country that once fought blind would later help pioneer precision electronics and microtechnology. Out of the ashes of defeat came the seeds of innovation. The men who had served aboard the radar picket ships seldom spoke of glory. They remembered the noise, the exhaustion, the endless blips on the scope that each meant a human life ending mid-air. Yet they also understood what their struggle meant, not only for the war but for the age that followed. They had seen the moment when courage met circuitry, when bravery alone was no longer enough. By the summer of 1945, the kamikaze sky had fallen silent. What replaced it was a new, unseen battlefield, one made of frequencies, reflections, and signals. And in that silence, the world crossed a threshold, from the era of the warrior to the era of the engineer. The Battle of Okinawa was more than the final step toward Japan's surrender. It was the moment when warfare itself changed forever. For centuries, combat had been measured by courage, muscle, and will. At Okinawa, it was measured in microseconds. in the pulse of invisible waves, in the hum of vacuum tubes, in the silent turning of radar antennas that could see beyond the human eye. The kamikaze pilots embodied humanity's most tragic devotion, the willingness to die for belief. The radar operators represented its new reality, the willingness to trust machines to preserve life. Between them lay a truth as old as war, that courage without understanding becomes sacrifice, and knowledge without empathy becomes cold precision. Radar-guided guns did not just protect ships, they marked the rise of a new kind of soldier, one who fought not with muscle or rage, but with mathematics and light. The sailors who stared into those glowing screens were the first of a new generation, warriors of data, defenders of the unseen. In the decades that followed, radar would evolve into satellites, missiles, and digital command networks. The same invisible waves that saved ships at Okinawa would one day guide humanity's most powerful weapons and its most peaceful technologies. Yet, in that spring of 1945, none of the men who fought beneath those skies could have known what they were beginning. They only knew that for a few hours each day, they stood between chaos and civilization, guided by a soundless beacon spinning above the waves. And so, the story of radar and the kamikaze is not one of victory alone. It is the story of how humanity learned to look beyond its limits, and how, in doing so, it changed the very nature of war. If you felt this story brought the past to life, subscribe to the channel and share where in the world you're watching from. Because history, like radar, connects us all across invisible distances. History isn't just written in books, it's written in courage, invention, and sacrifice. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Honor those who fought beneath those skies. Subscribe for more untold WWIIUSWarStories stories, where every battle hides a lesson and every invention changed humanity's path. Tell us in the comments which country or city you're watching from and what part of this story struck you most. Because in every radar pulse, in every silent frequency, history still echoes.